Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. In the grand tapestry of history, the lives of royal women are often woven with threads of gold and silk, presented to us as enchanting fairy tales of beautiful princesses and valiant princes. But if you dare to pull at those threads, to look closer at the intricate patterns, the silk and gold can unravel. Beneath the shimmering surface often lies a story of brutal, unforgiving reality. This is one of those stories. It is not a tale of gentle courtship or romantic destiny, but one of conquest, blood, and fire. This is the horrifying and ultimately inspiring story of Rogneda of Polotsk, a princess who was not won, but broken and claimed as a spoil of war. To understand Rogneda's fate, we must first transport ourselves back to the 10th century, to the vast, untamed lands of the Kievan Rus. This was not a unified kingdom in the way we might imagine one today. Instead, it was a volatile, ever-shifting patchwork of rising cities, dense forests, and powerful, warring princes. The air itself seemed to crackle with ambition and violence. This world was forged in the crucible of two mighty cultures, the fierce Viking adventurers, known in the East as Varangians, and the resilient Slavic tribes who had worked this land for centuries. It was a place where power was never given or inherited peacefully. It was taken violently, with the sharp edge of an axe and the unyielding will of a conqueror. And at the very center of our story, a young woman was born directly into this raging storm. Rogneda, Princess of Polotsk. Rogneda was no ordinary nobleman's daughter, destined for a quiet, provincial life. Her lineage placed her at the apex of this brutal society. Her father was the formidable Rogvolod, a powerful Varangian chieftain whose name was a Slavic rendering of the Old Norse Ragnvald. The Chronicles tell us he was a man who had come from overseas, a poetic way of saying he was part of the wave of Scandinavian warriors and traders who had carved out their own dominions in these Slavic lands. Rogvolod ruled the strategically vital city of Polotsk, a prosperous fortress city that sat astride the crucial river trade routes connecting the Viking heartlands of Scandinavia to the unimaginable riches of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. This route, a river road of trade and war, was the economic lifeblood of the Rus, and Polotsk was one of its most important gates. This heritage gave Rogneda an immense and dangerous status. She was, in essence, a Viking princess, a descendant of the sea kings of the north, and by all accounts, she was as beautiful as she was proud. In the ruthless political calculus of the 10th century, this made her a political prize of the very highest order. Her hand in marriage was not a matter of love, but a strategic tool that could seal a powerful alliance, legitimize a ruler's claim to power, and tip the scales in a war for ultimate control. And a war for control was precisely what was brewing. Following the death of the great conqueror Sviatoslav I, his sons were locked in a bitter and bloody struggle for his throne. In the grand capital of Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, sat Yaropolk, the legitimate heir. To the north, in the city of Novgorod, was his ambitious, energetic, and utterly ruthless half-brother, Vladimir. Vladimir was a military commander of terrifying brilliance, a man of boundless energy and charisma. But for all his strengths, he carried a deep and festering wound, a stain on his name that haunted his every move. His mother, Malusha, had not been a noblewoman. She had been a servant, a bondswoman in the court of his own grandmother, Princess Olga. In a world fanatically obsessed with bloodline and lineage, this was a crippling social disability. To his rivals, Vladimir was not a true prince. He was the son of a slave. It was an insult whispered in courts and shouted on battlefields, a vulnerability he would spend his entire life trying to erase with fire, with sword, and with the conquest of those who looked down on him. The two half-brothers, the legitimate heir and the resentful outsider, began to circle each other like wolves, preparing for a final, cataclysmic war that would decide the fate of the entire realm. In this high-stakes game, the Principality of Polotsk, with its powerful Varangian ruler and his highly desirable daughter, became the strategic key to victory. For Rogneda, this meant her life was not her own. She was no longer just a woman, but a pawn, the most valuable piece in a deadly game of thrones, and her next move would determine not only her own destiny, but the future of the Kievan Rus. As the storm of civil war gathered on the horizon, the strategic importance of Polotsk became undeniable. Both Yerepok and Kiev and Vladimir in Novgorod knew that an alliance with the powerful Varangian prince Rogvolod could be the decisive factor in their conflict. And the surest way to secure that alliance was through marriage to his daughter, Rogneda. According to the ancient chronicles, it was Vladimir of Novgorod who made the first bold move. He dispatched envoys, his trusted messengers, on the long journey to Polotsk to formally ask Rogvolod for Rogneda's hand. For Vladimir, this was a moment freighted with immense personal and political significance. This was far more than a simple strategic alliance. A marriage to Rogneda, a princess of pure, unblemished Varangian noble stock, was his chance to cleanse the perceived stain of his own birth. By joining his line with hers, he could silence the whispers and sneers. He would no longer be just the son of a slave. He would be the husband of a true northern princess, his legitimacy cemented, his status elevated in the eyes of all. The historical accounts, primarily the primary chronicle, state that upon receiving Vladimir's proposal, Rogvolod turned to his daughter and asked for her decision. On the surface, this might suggest that Rogneda, unlike many royal women of her era, possessed a degree of agency, that she had a genuine choice in the matter. However, the reality for a 10th century princess was almost certainly more complex. Her father's political calculations would have been the paramount consideration. Yerepok, ruling from the grand capital of Kiev, was the established, legitimate grand prince. Vladimir, though formidable, was the resentful outsider, a challenger operating from the northern frontier. An alliance with Yerepok seemed the safer, more prestigious, and more logical bet. Rogneda's personal feelings likely aligned with this political reality. Sources indicate she was already betrothed to Yerepok, the man she considered the rightful ruler. Whatever the precise calculation, Rogneda's reply, as recorded for all time in the primary chronicle, would echo through the centuries, sealing her fate and the fate of her people. With a pride and fire that matched her Varangian heritage, she declared, "I will not draw off the boots of a slave's son, but I want Yerepok instead." To modern ears, the phrase might seem strange, but in the customs of the 10th century Rus, it was an insult of catastrophic proportions. The ceremonial act of a new bride removing her husband's boots on their wedding night was a powerful gesture of wifely submission and acceptance of his authority. Rogneda's refusal was not just a rejection of a suitor, it was a calculated and deeply public humiliation. She was weaponizing Vladimir's greatest insecurity. She threw his inferior birth back in his face, shaming him not only personally, but in front of his envoys, his men, and by extension, all his enemies. She had made her choice, and her allegiance, devastatingly clear. She preferred the legitimate prince, Yerepok, the man she was already promised to. When Vladimir's messengers returned to Novgorod and dutifully reported Rogneda's stinging words, his ambition, which had burned hot, instantly curdled into a cold, murderous rage. This was no longer about a strategic marriage. It was now a matter of honor, of vengeance. The insult was a spark thrown into the powder keg of his resentment and ambition. Rogneda and her father, Rogvolod, had made a fatal and horrifying miscalculation. They had sized up the two brothers and placed their bet on the established power. In doing so, they had profoundly underestimated the chilling ferocity of the man they had just so publicly and so personally scorned. Vladimir was no longer seeking an alliance. Now he was seeking blood. Vladimir's revenge was not a distant threat. It was an immediate and terrifying storm that broke with shocking speed. Fueled by the sting of Rogneda's insult, he did not waste time with political maneuvering. He gathered a formidable army, a force of his own loyal northern troops bolstered by fierce Varangian mercenaries, his kinsmen from across the sea, warriors who lived for battle and plunder. And he did not march south towards his primary rival in Kiev. Instead, he turned his army and his rage directly on Polotsk. For Rogvolod and Rogneda, secure in their fortress city, the world must have suddenly shrunk to the horrifying sight of the approaching dust cloud of Vladimir's army on the horizon. They had placed their bet on Yerepok, but Kiev was far away, its armies distant and slow to mobilize. Vladimir was here, now at their gates. Though Polotsk was a strong, well-defended city, it could not hope to stand against the sheer numbers and the white-hot fury of Vladimir's assault. The siege was short and brutal. The city fell. What happened next is recorded as one of the most savage and personally vindictive episodes in the medieval chronicles. Vladimir, the spurned suitor, the son of a slave who had been so publicly shamed, stormed the captured city and seized Rogneda's entire family, her father Rogvolod and her two brothers. The most infamous and horrific detail of this event comes to us from later sources, such as the Suzdalian Chronicle. These later accounts state that Vladimir, in an act of ultimate debasement and psychological warfare, violated Rogneda directly in front of her captive parents. He then, supposedly, forced the traumatized princess to watch as he had her father and her two brothers mercilessly put to the sword. It is critically important, as historians, to approach this specific detail with a degree of caution. The earliest and most contemporary source, the primary chronicle, which records her insult in vivid detail, does not include the element of the assault happening in her parents' presence. Many historians believe this particularly graphic part of the story may have been embellished or dramatized by later monastic writers. Their goal would have been to paint Vladimir in the darkest possible light, to emphasize his monstrous brutality as a pagan, thereby making his eventual, famous conversion to Christianity seem all the more miraculous and transformative. But whether the attack happened exactly as the later chronicles describe it or not, the underlying truth reflects the terrible and inescapable reality of conquest for women in this era. They were treated as the ultimate spoils of war, their bodies becoming territory to be conquered along with their cities. In a single, horrific campaign, Vladimir had brutally erased the insult against him. He had not only silenced a critic, but had utterly annihilated a rival dynasty, burning its city and executing its male heirs. And he had claimed the very woman who rejected him, not as an honored bride, but as a captive. Her pride was shattered, her family was dead, her city was in ashes, and her entire world had been destroyed. In the smoldering ruins of her home, Vladimir then forcibly married the traumatized princess, binding her to him as a permanent symbol of his victory and her family's annihilation. Some legends even claim he gave her a new name, Gorislava, meaning one of great sorrow or one of burning glory, a constant reminder of her tragic fate. With the strategic and personal victory at Polotsk complete, Vladimir's path to ultimate power was clear. He marched his triumphant army south to the grand capital, Kiev. His brother Yaropolk, now isolated and deprived of his key potential ally, was betrayed by his own advisors and lured into a fatal trap. He was killed by Vladimir's men, leaving the path to the throne open. And so it was that Vladimir, the slave's son, the scorned outsider, became the undisputed, sole ruler of all the Kievan Rus. For Rogneda, life transformed into a gilded cage. Torn from the ashes of her homeland, she was taken to Kiev and installed as one of Vladimir's wives. As a pagan ruler, Vladimir maintained a large and complex household, adhering to the custom of polygamy. The primary chronicle speaks of him having hundreds of concubines and several official wives, each representing a political alliance or a conquest. Rogneda, despite her high birth and proud Varangian blood, was now just one among them, a living trophy of her family's fatal miscalculation. She was given a residence near Kiev, in a place that would later be named Predslavino after a daughter she would bear, but it was a place of exile, not honor. She bore Vladimir several children who would become significant figures in history, including her firstborn, Izyaslav, and another son, Yaroslav, who would one day be known as Yaroslav the Wise, one of the greatest rulers in Kiev's history. But Rogneda never forgot. She never forgave. The humiliation, the loss, and the trauma of the sack of Polotsk festered within her for years. The chronicles paint a picture of an unhappy woman, living separately from her husband, a constant, brooding reminder of his violent past. Then, as one legendary tale, likely originating from a Norse saga, recounts, she decided that if she could not have justice, she would have her own revenge. The story unfolds like a scene of high drama from a northern epic. One night, years after her capture, as Vladimir visited her chambers and lay sleeping, Rogneda saw her chance. In the quiet darkness, she took a dagger, her heart filled with a decade of grief and rage, and moved to kill the man who had destroyed her world. But at the very last moment, perhaps from a glint of steel or a sudden sound, Vladimir awoke. He grabbed her hand, the blade stopping just inches from his heart. His initial shock turned instantly to a volcanic rage. For a wife to attempt to kill her husband, her prince, was the ultimate treason, punishable by immediate death. The Chronicles say he was ready to execute her on the spot. He ordered her to dress in her finest royal robes, a ceremonial preparation for her own death, and to await his return. But in that moment of terror, Rogneda conceived one last, desperate plan. She rushed to her young son, Izyaslav, her firstborn with Vladimir, and pressed a sword into his small hands, telling him what he must do to protect his mother. When Vladimir, sword in hand, strode back into the room to carry out the execution, he was met with an astonishing sight. Standing between him and Rogneda was his own child, no more than a boy, defiantly holding a sword and facing his father. The young Izyaslav cried out, "Father, you think you are alone here? You are not. Your son will be a witness to this deed." The act was so audacious, so courageous, it stopped the hardened warrior prince in his tracks. To kill a woman was one thing in this brutal age. To execute the mother of his child in front of that very child, his own son and heir, was a line that even the ruthless Vladimir could not bring himself to cross. He dropped his own sword, stunned into inaction. This dramatic confrontation, whether it is a precise historical account or a later invention to explain subsequent events, marks the critical turning point in Rogneda's story. Her life was spared, but her fate, and that of her son, now hung by the slenderest of threads. Stymied by his own son's astonishing act of courage, the enraged but conflicted Vladimir found himself in a political and personal bind. He could not bring himself to execute Rogneda in front of Izyaslav, yet he could not let such a brazen attempt on his life go unpunished. He did what powerful rulers do when faced with a dilemma. He consulted his council of nobles, the boyars. Their advice was a masterstroke of political savvy, wrapped in the language of mercy. For the sake of this child, they reportedly told him, "Do not kill her. Instead, restore to her that which was her own. Restore her patrimony, and give it to her to rule with her son." And so, Vladimir exiled Rogneda and her young son, Izyaslav. But this was not an exile into shame or obscurity. In a move that was both a punishment and a clever political solution, he sent them back to her father's lands, the very same principality of Polotsk that he himself had ravaged years before. He established a new fortified city for them, which became known as Izyaslav in honor of the brave son who had saved his mother's life. From this act of banishment, an entirely new and powerful dynasty was unexpectedly born. Rogneda, the brutalized victim of conquest, was transformed into a ruler in her own right, the regent for her son. And Izyaslav became the first in what would be a long and fiercely independent line of Polotsk princes, the Izyaslaviki, who would rule the region for centuries to come. Rogneda's incredible story, however, doesn't end there. Years later, in 988, Vladimir the Great famously converted to Orthodox Christianity, a pivotal event known as the baptism of the Rus. As part of his transformation, he was required to take a legitimate Christian wife, the Byzantine princess Anna Porphyrogenita, and to divorce all his previous pagan wives. Later tradition, recorded in the Tver Chronicle, holds that Vladimir formally offered Rogneda her freedom and the chance to marry any one of his high-ranking boyars. In a final, magnificent display of the pride that had once cost her so dearly, Rogneda refused. She is said to have replied that she, a princess by birth, could never bring herself to marry a man of lower rank. Instead, she chose a different path of power and prestige in this new Christian world. She declared her wish to become a bride of Christ and entered a convent, taking the monastic name Anastasia. Some historical accounts even credit her with founding one of the very first monasteries in the region, becoming a pioneer of female monasticism in the newly Christianized land. Rogneda died around the year 1000, having lived a life of almost unimaginable trauma and transformation. Her story is a stark and brutal reminder of the precarious, often horrific, position of women caught in the violent power struggles of the medieval world. She was a pawn in a dynastic war, a prize to be claimed, and a victim of appalling violence. But she was also, unequivocally, a survivor. From the ashes of her family's complete destruction, she endured. She waited. She plotted her revenge, and through a desperate, courageous gamble, she not only saved her own life, but secured a powerful and lasting legacy for her children. A legacy that would give rise to a dynasty that shaped the history of Eastern Europe for generations. If you found this story of resilience, revenge, and survival compelling, please show your support for Chronicles of Old Tales by liking this video and subscribing for more hidden histories from our past. What do you think of Rogneda's incredible and brutal life journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for another tale of strength in the face of tragedy, click here to watch our video on the tragic lives of royal women. Thank you for watching.